The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alan Blumkin. I'm here with my good friend David Nemec for another session of David Nemec's History and Trivia. And today we're going to be discussing pre-expansion pennant collapses. Okay, welcome, David. Happy New Year.
Pleasure to be with you again, Al. Happy New Year to you.
Okay, David suggested we start with the 1891 pennant race in the National League. Okay, David, your ballpark.
I have to admit, the 19th century is my bailiwick. I can get lost in almost anything that happened in the 19th century, but the 1891 season really kind of dominates my thinking. And it doesn't involve a pennant collapse, a team folding in the stretch, so much as something very, very different. We're to look at the end of the National League pennant race, and starting with the date of September 5th. Chicago has moved into Boston, leading the National League comfortably, and takes 2 out of 3 from Boston, which is in second place at the time, and leaves Boston with a 6-game lead on the evening of December 5th. And the season...
December?
It's September 5th. No, I didn't say December, did I? Must have been thinking about the winters. Okay. Well, the winter is when everything really exploded that year at the winter meetings. Because Chicago leads with a comfortable league. They've been more or less leading all season. They seem to have a better team. But the season dissolves in their face, not because they play poorly, but because peculiarly everybody Boston plays after September 5th plays abysmally. And as a result, when we come to the end of the season, and let me just bring that up shortly, that 6-game lead has evaporated by October 1st to a 2.5-game deficit. And Boston, in effect, since there are only 2 games left to play, has clinched the pennant. Because they even though they lose both games to Philadelphia, they have, previous to that, gone on an incredible winning streak against the NL East, beginning on September, if I'm not mistaken, on September 6th. Beginning on September 8th. They go into Cleveland. Wait a minute. They go into Cleveland. Cleveland plays them straight up. They end up winning 3 out of 4, nevertheless. And they play Cincinnati. Cincinnati plays them straight up. They go into Chicago on the 14th, and they lose 2 out of 3 there. So they leave Chicago on the 16th. And going into the 17th, they still are trailing the Chicago Colts by 5.5 games. They've caught up a little bit, and they're starting. There's still a race. And what happens between September 16th and the end of the season is that Boston goes on an incredible winning streak against New York, Brooklyn, and then
Philadelphia.
And Philadelphia. Philadelphia loses, and as a result goes on a winning streak that takes them from County Pittsburgh. They tie with Pittsburgh on the 17th. Then they lose the next 2 games to Pittsburgh. 3 games to Pittsburgh. Then they go into Brooklyn and lose all 4 games. Go to Philadelphia, lose 3 straight. Go to New York and manage to lose 5 straight. And these are all decent teams in 1891. And then finish the season winning at Philadelphia on the first and clinching the pennant. And then winning again in the second, but then losing the final game on the third. And ending the season with a 2.5-game lead. And it's not because Chicago has played badly. They've played very well. But what has happened is suspicions have been aroused throughout the league. And Arthur Irwin, who is managing in the American Association in 1891, the Boston team, which wins the AA pennant and was destined to play the winner of the National League in a World Series if it was Chicago, because even though the rest of the National League shut down all activity, all relations with the American Association, Chicago and Cap Anson promised to continue to play the World Series between the 2 leagues that have been extant ever since 1884. And it depended on Chicago winning the pennant because Boston, the National League Boston team, refused to play. And all National League teams refused to play if they won. But the only team really with a chance was Boston. And what develops is that Irwin outright accuses the National League Eastern teams, Pittsburgh, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and particularly New York, of throwing the pennant to Chicago. And this sounds like, wow, why don't we know about this? Why hasn't history written, why hasn't this ever been really investigated in any depth? Well, it has to an extent. Charles Alexander, I know, did some investigation of it and comes up with a conclusion, yeah, it's very suspicious, but no absolute proof, no smoking gun. But as a result, at the winter meetings, Cap Anson comes in livid, really accusing everybody right and left of conspiring to throw the pennant Boston's way, even though Chicago has played very good ball, and not meeting with much resistance in the way of opposition or argument, but meeting with the Pittsburgh owner named Palmer, who diffuses Anson successfully, because Anson's ready to fight. He actually is ready to do battle physically over what he thinks was highway robbery of the pennant. So this is probably the only time in Major League history where a team has won the pennant, not because for coming from a long way back, 5.5 games back on September 16th, and not won the pennant because of their opposition having a collapse of any sort, but simply because their opposition not playing standard of baseball that's expected, which is to, even though you're a trailing team and nothing really at stake, you do the best you can in a pennant race to the very end, especially when you're playing contending teams. So this is that rare and maybe only one-of-a-kind pennant race where things really turn topsy-turvy with Chicago carrying a seemingly insurmountable lead, Boston winning the pennant, Boston refusing to meet the Boston American Association team in the World Series, and ultimately the American Association crumbling and combining with the National League in 1892, which was the result, which was desired all along. And that, to my mind, is a place we can start, because after that we're going to be talking about teams that collapsed more so than teams that won a pennant without really deserving it. But Al, why don't you take over and give us one of your best?
Okay, one of the ones that is legendary is 1951 between the Dodgers and Giants. The Dodgers had a 13.5 game lead in August, middle of August, and they wound up losing the pennant on in a 3-game playoff on Bobby Thompson's shot around the world. And what happened is the Giants got very, very hot. They won 16 straight, and they cut the lead to, I think it was 4 at that point. And the Dodgers, I mean, there's a lot of speculation that the Giants were stealing signs, a la the Astros 2017. But the Dodgers played very, very mediocre ball from that point on. Charlie Dressen had burned up his relievers, and he refused to pitch Clem Labine because Clem Labine gave up a Grand Slam home run in a game in early September. He refused to use him until he was forced to use him in Game 2 of the playoffs. And and the Giants caught them on the last day of the season. You look at the numbers on some of the Dodgers, especially Duke Snider, who came down pretty badly from 1950, and Carl Ferrillo, who stopped hitting because he had eye problems, which weren't really diagnosed until after 1952. And the whole team just was, was shaky. And the Giants persevered. They had the 2 stars that they really overworked were Sal Magley and Larry Jansen. But they caught them, and there's a 3-game playoff. The Giants won the first game 3-1. In fact, in that game, which was at Ebbets Field, Bobby Thompson hit a home run off Ralph Branca. And the Giants, the Dodgers won 10-0 in the second game behind Clem Labine. The Giants started a pitcher named Sheldon Jones, who was 6-11 that year, 6-10 going into that game, and they wound up trading him to the Braves after that season, and he faded very, very quickly. And then they brought in Newcomb to start Game 3. And Newcomb pitched into the 9th, and was complaining about being tired, and Jackie Robinson was urging him to stay in. And one of the problems the Dodgers had in that game was that Campanella had a thigh injury, and Dressen was afraid of the foul territory in the Polo Grounds, that Campanella wouldn't be able to go back after a fly ball, so he started Rube Walker the backup.
Wow.
And, the rest is history. Newcomb, in the 9th inning, the Dodgers have a 3-run lead going to the bottom of the 9th, and Dark leads off with a single. Don Mueller hits a single, and there was a number of people said, well, if Dodgers had not been holding Dark on, which was idiotic with a 3-run lead, that Mueller would have hit a double play. And I asked Mueller about this at a card show many years ago, and he said it was like duck hunting. He says if Dodgers were playing normal, he would try to hit the ball to the outfield, center field. So he felt he really did not get credit for that. And then
Mueller had a really good bat, so he was Mandrake the musician.
Yeah.
And, so he could.
Monty Irvin popped out. Lockman hit a double, which made it 4-2. On the double, Bueller slid into third base and broke his ankle, and the Giants sent in the Hondo Hurricane, Clint Hartung, to run for him. And Clint Hartung, when he came out of the Army, was supposed to be the second coming of Babe Ruth and Walter Johnson combined. And he didn't live up to it. That's probably his first moment. Then they take out Branca because they had no relief pitchers at all. Carl Erskine was the other pitcher warming up in the bullpen with Branca. Carl Erskine was a starter. and we all know the result. But the Dodgers' collapse was in the last 2 months was pretty bad. If you look at their record, they were about 500 for the last 6 weeks, and the Giants got very, very hot, and they were able to close the gap on them.
I was still very young, but I do remember that season very well, and remember the World Series vividly. And I didn't watch it on live TV, but when I came home from school, it was rebroadcast. I was living in Cleveland at the time, and they did show Thompson's home run, and it was an incredible comeback. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a team lost a clutch game like that with a 3-run lead in the bottom of the ninth in such a weird and and Al gave a very, very good description of what happened. And reading about it and everything I've read about it, he captured all the key components, and that was certainly one of the greatest collapses of all time. And the one it's always stood out in my mind even more than that, to a degree, what happened in 1964 in the National League race. At the end of September, date of September 20th, 1964, after 150 games had been played, the Philadelphia Phillies stood 90-60 and held a 6.5 game lead in the National League with only 12 games left to play. And by the end of the season, on the final day in the season, the Phils were no longer even in the pennant race. They had been eliminated the day before, after probably the most distinctive collapse in history since 1951. And what all they could do was play the role of spoilers and beat the Cincinnati Reds, which had started them on their downslide, so that the St. Louis Cardinals, who were 6.5 games behind on September 20th, snuck into first place on the very final day of the season and clinched the pennant. It was absolutely an incredible run of the Phillies, and they were managed by Gene Mauch, and Mauch never lived it down. It's clear that Mauch did start to panic after that date. They left Los Angeles, and wait a minute. On the 20th of September, after beating the Dodgers 3-2 in a close game, they went into Cincinnati the following night and played the Reds. And as my memory brings it back, I watched that game on TV, and I was at Ohio State at the time in school, and so Cincinnati pulled it out when Chico Ruiz, am I right on that, Al?
Yes,
Chico Ruiz stole home, and for the only run of the game, and Cincinnati won 1-0, and the Dodgers went out, and the Phillies were swept in the 3-game series by the Reds, moved into Milwaukee, lost 4 straight to Milwaukee, moved to St. Louis, lost 3 straight to St. Louis, moved back to Cincinnati for their final 2 games on October 2nd and October 4th, with no chance themselves of winning the pennant, and then beat the Reds in both games, 4-3 and 10-0. And as a result, the Cardinals won the pennant. And it was, and I was a Phillies fan at the time. I was rooting for them. I always liked the Phillies, even as a kid. I had seen the Whiz Kids play in a game against Pittsburgh, and I always followed the Phillies and felt sorry for them because they had so little. They really had so little to root for so many years, except for that 1950 season. And I was heavily, behind them in 1964, and I felt it with them. and Mark panicked, misused his pitching staff down the, started, he had really didn't, his pitchers were worn out. Bunning was his key man. He was worn out. Chris Short was worn out. And Mark kept throwing them out there, and he couldn't find a third starter. Art Mahaffey, he tried everything. Nothing worked, and it was sad to see. But it was probably a managerial panic as much as anything else. Would you agree with that, Al?
Yeah, I have a couple of things to add to that. The Phillies wound up tied with the Reds for second place, one game behind. And the Cardinals came in, they hosted the Mets, who were terrible for the last weekend, and the Mets beat them Friday and Saturday. They couldn't clinch. So the Sunday game, if the Mets had beaten them the Sunday, it would have wound up in a three-way tie.
I do remember that now. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and I was rooting for that to happen because it would have been a first.
It would have been the only time.
The only time a three-way tie would have happened. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is that Jim Bunning was the keynote speaker at the SABR convention in 1997 in Louisville. And he was asked about 1964, and he said that Mark panicked, and exactly what you said. He panicked, and he overworked them. And there's a story that came out quite a few years ago that Sports Illustrated wanted to do a major article on Mark, and they were negotiating terms, and Mark refused to talk about 1964. So they killed the article.
Yeah.
And the Dodgers were involved with a couple of others. 1942. In August, they had a 9.5 game lead over the Cardinals.
If I may break in for just 1 second, do you
sure.
remember if there was a plan established as to what was going to happen if there were a three-way tie?
No, I don't remember. It was either a round robin or they drew for one team to get the bye, and I have no idea. Because if they had a round robin, it would have taken forever. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it could have taken forever. Yeah, you're right. And it's So it's I don't remember, and that I'll have to look that up because I think I remember it and I'd forgotten, and I'm going to look that up and find out what it was, and you and I will talk about it. I know privately, and we'll get to that. But go ahead because you're on a really interesting season too.
Okay, 1942, the Cardinals, who had a pretty good team, led by Slaughter and the Cooper brothers, Walker and Mort Cooper, and several others, including a rookie outfielder by the name of Stan Musial, who turned out to be pretty good. And the Dodgers were playing very well, and then Pete Reeser decided to run into a wall. And he ran into the wall. And he was supposed to be out a month or a month and a half, and he was rushed back in. Because Larry McPhail, who was running the Dodgers at that point, told DeRosa to play Reeser, even though Reeser was still injured. And the Dodgers, Reeser went from hitting 380 to 310, and the Dodgers just completely collapsed. The Cardinals got very, very, very hot, and they wound up winning the pennant by 2 games. And then, of course, went on to beat the Yankees in the World Series 4-1. But that Cardinal team, got exceptionally hot. There's a book out on that came out a number of years ago called Fleer Than Birds. The McFarlane book that goes into that whole season. But that was that was very, very. The Dodgers, of course, were also coming off 1941 when they won the National League pennant.
Yeah.
And the other one I want to mention is 1962. The Dodgers had a 4-game lead over the Giants going into the last week of the season. 7 games left. The Dodgers scored 1 run in their last, I think in the last game, and they were shut out 4 times by the Cardinal pitchers during that stretch. You know, the Dodgers are really hurt when Koufax developed a finger problem and could hardly pitch after the All-Star game. But that was an incredible collapse. And again, like in 1951, it resulted in a 3-game playoff. The Giants won the first game behind Billy Pierce, who they had picked up over the winter previously from the White Sox. He was a longtime White Sox ace. The second game, they had a 5-0 lead, and the Dodgers got 7 runs in the bottom of the 6th inning and wound up winning that game. Game 3 was almost a repeat of Game 3 in 1951. The Dodgers carried a 2-run lead into the top of the 9th. All they had to do was get the Giants out in the top of the 9th, and the pennant was there. They brought in Stan Williams, who walked the ballpark, and there was an error in there that helped things along. And the Giants got 4 runs on a bunch of slop, walks and errors. And then they brought in Billy Pierce to get the final 3 outs in the bottom of the 9th, and he did. And the Giants won a very, very unexpected pennant.
Yeah, that was.
Do you remember that one at all?
I do. I remember it well. One I do not remember from my lifetime, but I do remember reading about, though, was the 1906 season in the American League, which really has received little discussion in recent years. After play on April 4th, the Philadelphia Athletics were in first place with a 2.5-game lead over the New York Highlanders. Behind them were the Cleveland Naps in third place, 7 games back, and in fourth place, 7.5 games back, with the Chicago White Sox, with 3 teams in front of them to catch in order to win the pennant. And this was on August 4th. Philadelphia played 94 games. They had a 59-34 record. When we skip ahead to the close of the season, Philadelphia ends up in fourth place, and the Chicago White Sox, out of nowhere, come on to win the pennant. So, and Philadelphia suffers ends up with a 78-67 record, which is a very so-so record. And the White Sox go on an incredible winning streak. They held the record prior to the Oakland A's. I can't remember what the A's season was when they broke it. And Cleveland broke it, of course. And
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Cleveland then broke it in 2017.
Yeah.
But previous to that, the White Sox held the record, and they did an incredible job of during that time, and they were called. Their nickname as a result has been etched permanently beside that season, and it was they were called the Hitless Wonders. This was in the heart of the dead ball era. They didn't get much hitting. They got fantastic pitching, and went on that record-winning streak in late August and September, and pulled ahead of Cleveland, which was ahead of them, pulled ahead of the Highlanders, pulled ahead of the A's, and the A's wound up fourth. They're just a reverse, pretty much, of the way the standings had stood as of mid-August by the end of the season. It's a comeback, and and something of a collapse that really hasn't as yet received the attention it should.
Well, the thing is also, I just want to mention that the Yankees won 19 straight in 1947 to tie them, the record that the White Sox set. And another one which came to me when I was reading David Fleitz's excellent bio of Eddie Seacott. The 1920 White Sox were battling the Indians and the Yankees for the pennant in that season. And the White Sox, who were favored, and everybody was waiting for them to open it up. And in early September, went on a losing streak to teams that there was, I think, 7 in a row to teams that were like the Browns and teams that were not very good. And the suspicion, of course, is that the gamblers still had their hooks into the Black Sox players in 1920, and telling them that they had to lose these games.
Yeah,
and that's what.
1927 season, 1920 season, but 1919 has somewhat eclipsed the 1920 season in baseball lore, so that the 1927 season doesn't get all the attention it deserves. But it was full of firsts and lasts and bizarre happenings, including the only death of a player directly as a result of a baseball injury, confirmed death. There's a suspicion that others have died too of injuries later. But Ray Chapman, of course, was killed by a pitch. The Indians went on to win the pennant. In the series, there was the only unassisted triple play in a World Series, the first home run by a pitcher, the first Grand Slam home run in a World Series game. And it was full of a lot of interesting things. But I'd like to move to the 1935 season, if we could, because that one that was really one. Another Chicago team was involved, the Cubs, and they went on an incredible winning streak, which began on the 4th of September when they were playing they played the Phillies and won 8-2. And at that time, they were only 2.5 games behind the Cardinals, and the Cardinals didn't play badly from then on. But the White Sox went on an incredible tear. The Cubs. I'm sorry, the Cubs went on an incredible tear, and overtook the Cardinals. Which played good ball all the way through. Overtook the Giants, and they went very unexpectedly. Went to the World Series, and lost there, and continued their streak of losing series that lasted until 2016. And but that winning streak they went on toward the end of the season hasn't gotten as much attention as it needs, because they didn't really probably have the best team in the National League at all. And they certainly weren't favored, preseason favored to win the pennant. They had Chuck Klein still, and they were hoping that Klein was going to, seemed to be in a funk after he was injured in 34, would come back and have a great season, but he didn't. And in fact, he had so bad a season that he saw very little action in the World Series, which the Cubs ended up losing. But it was an incredible streak. And you were talking about the 1921 season, weren't you?
The Pirates had a big lead, and they came into the Polo Grounds, and the Giants beat them for a 5-game series. I assume it was makeup of rainouts, and the Giants won all 5 games in that series, and they wound up beating the Pirates out for the pennant. I think another Pirate collapse was in 1938 when they were so optimistic that they started building World Series press boxes and everything, and they wound up losing to the Cubs.
And the Homer and the Gloman.
Yeah,
too.
and
Like Gabby Hardnett. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're talking about impossible things, of course you have the Miracle Braves of 1914 that were 26-40 at one point, and then they wound up winning national in last place, and they wound up winning the National League pennant and then sweeping the A's in the World Series. That team was a one-year wonder, though. Yeah.
But if we could go back to the 38 season for a moment, look at the final standings. We see the Cubs winning by 2 games, but they played 154 games, which was a season schedule, but 2 of the games were ties. And so they really ended up only with 152 decisions. The Pirates also ended up with only 150 decisions. They played 2 ties in only 152 games. If the season had been played to completion, as it supposedly should have been in those years, and I've never understood why it wasn't, the Pirates could have overtaken the Cubs, or certainly tied for the pennant. And if they'd won all 4 of their games, and the Cubs had lost the 2 games that they missed, the Pirates would have won the pennant outright. And I have never understood, nor have I ever received an explanation from anyone that why those games were never played. I don't know if you've ever talked about it with anyone else, but no one's ever really. These kinds of things somehow don't receive discussion, and I'm surprised because there are a number of pennant races where this happened.
1908, the American League was the.
Well, but that was supposedly when they changed things.
Yeah.
So there were games that needed to be made up. They were made up if they had bearings on the pennant race. But here we are, 1908, 30 years later, in a pennant race that featured games that weren't made up, and it seems to me should have been, and I don't know why they weren't. I'd love for our listening audience, if anybody knows out there, I think both of us would love to hear from them, that they know a reason why these games weren't, because it's apparent that the rule, if there was one, wasn't really enforced throughout history. And there are some other interesting seasons too. I mean, where this kind of thing occurred.
Well, and the division, since the divisions came into effect in 1969, the biggest, then you have to exclude. As far as I'm concerned, you have to exclude when from 1994 on, when they made the 3 divisions in the wild card. 1978 Yankees were 14 and a half games behind the the Red Sox. And then the Yankees had gotten rid of Billy Martin, who was involved with that fight with Reggie Jackson, and he was dismissed. That's when he said that Steinbrenner was convicted and Reggie Jackson was a liar, and they fired him. And Martin was hitting the source pretty heavily then, and they brought in Bob Lemon, the Hall of Fame pitcher, as manager, and he was a very, very calming influence. And they started to play really, really terrific ball. The Red Sox, on the other hand, were managed by Don Zimmer, and they had a couple of injuries. But one of the things that Zimmer insisted is playing for third base Butch Hobson, who wound up fielding under 900 for the year.
That's the only
which is
time
pretty impressive. Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
He's the last guy to field under 900. I don't think it hasn't happened since. I'm not sure. And we have to almost go back to the teens when an outfielder fielded less than 900. But third base is a tough position, but it's not that tough. And,
the Yankees. Yeah, the Yankees went up to Boston in September and beat the hell out of them 4 straight games. It was called the Boston Massacre. I mean, I watched those games. They were never in doubt from the get-go, and they wound up tied for the division and went into a playoff game on October 2nd, 1978. I watched that game because it was the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, and I was off from work. And that's the game that the Red Sox had a lead, and then Bucky Dent, of all people, had a 3-run home run off Mike Torres, who had been a Yankee in 1977 and won 2 World Series games, but signed with the Red Sox as a free agent. Bucky Dent hit a 3-run home run, put the Yankees up, and the Yankees held on in the bottom of the ninth to beat them, and then went on to beat the Kansas City Royals in the playoff and the Dodgers in the World Series. But that's the only one that I can really call as, since the division ever started, unless you count the Chicago Cubs in 1969 and the National League East.
Definitely should. Yeah, that was another season that. Very important season in terms of a collapse.
That was the first year of division play, and the Mets, of all teams, who were pretty terrible up until that season, got very, very hot, and the Cubs just collapsed. In fact, a Saberman named Don Zminda, Zminda, did a presentation at one of the Nationals on the Cubs in Wrigley Field in late August and September. And he postulated the theory that the Cubs, because they played all day games, were worn out by the time the late season rolled around, and also they were managed by DeRocha, who was really past his peak and refused to give any of his starting players a day off.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember really rooting hard for the Cubs that year because it had been so long since they'd won anything. 1945 was the last even close sniff of, let alone a postseason appearance. And, I remember rooting for them. My Indians, as usual, in those years, were out of it pretty quickly. In fact, they finished dead last in their division. And so I was rooting hard for the Cubs. And I remember, all that summer following them and saying, well, they look pretty good. But I went out to a Mets game. I remember I was living in New York at the time. And the Mets beat the Giants in a game. And they looked very impressive. They were much, because I hadn't seen them play, and I saw them off and on during the 6 years. I had never seen the team look that strong, anywhere near that strong as I did that night. I remember when I took a friend to the game, I said, this team looks pretty good, and I'm not so sure that the Cubs we can just count them out. And my friend was also rooting for the Cubs. He was from Cleveland. And we both walked out and said, they looked awful good. And from that point on, they continued, and they did a strong, they really had a strong August and September, and they won it going away. And then, of course, they wiped out the Braves in the first division series for playoffs, and then took on the Orioles, who were extremely heavy favorites, as I recall. And
I was at three games in that World Series. I was at the 2 in Baltimore over the weekend, and wow. I went to work on the Tuesday, and somebody called me up and they had extra tickets for the game at Shea Stadium, and I asked my boss if I could go, and he said, yeah, go ahead. And I went there. The seats were in section 48 in the upper deck, which is the last section of the upper deck. It didn't help my acrophobia very much. But that was the game where A.J. made the 2 catches, and it was remarkable. I mean, then they brought in people brought in televisions for the last 2 games, and to work because this was such an incredible phenomenon that they had come out of totally nowhere to be in a position like this.
Yeah.
The only Hall of Famer they had on that team as a player was Seaver.
Yeah, that's true. That's still true. It probably always will be. I can't imagine Kuzma making it. I can't imagine Cleon Jones ever making it.
No, none of them had big enough, good enough careers to.
No, they had
to get
Jones
in,
had a great season, but that was he never had one like it. And when you look at that team, look at their lineup. It's very hard to recall. Some of their regulars. I know Cranepool was on first, and Harrelson there?
Harrelson was the shortstop. The second baseman, they had 2. They had Ken Boswell and I forgot Al Weiss, who became a World Series hero.
Yeah, out of nowhere. I remember that.
Yeah.
And then everything just seemed to break right.
Weiss made that catch in the outfield in game 4 of Brooks Robinson, which I've seen 100 times. I still can't believe it.
I know. I know. Yeah, I watched a couple of those games on TV, but I admit I didn't see the entire series. But yeah, that was if I'm not wrong, was that the last series that was played entirely in the daytime? Or was it the 71 series?
71 had the first night game, and in 70 they had a 70, I think in Cincinnati, they had a Sunday night game. No, that wasn't too late. That was till 1976. But the 71 was the first year that they had a night game.
71.
Then they made the weekday games night games, because I went to the 3 games when the A's played the Mets here in 1973. Those were all night games. And 76 they had the Sunday night game where Bowie Kuhn is sitting out there with no overcoat and probably 10 sets of thermals. And then then the next year I went to the All-Star game in Yankee Stadium in 1977, and it was like 105 degrees. And they announced Bowie Kuhn was there. I yelled out. I was all the way up in the upper deck behind home plate. I yelled out, "I want the SOB is wearing an overcoat to show us this is not."
He might have been, but nothing under it. Who knows? Yeah,
but that was
never know it was Bowie and what he was doing. Yeah.
And then they made all night games. I think they made it in I think 79 was all night games.
Yeah, and since I regret that. I regret a lot of things that have been changed over the years, but that's one of the prime ones, because even though, even as a kid, there was no way I could watch every game because I had school. And there weren't any tape delays that would play late at night or anything like that then. So you just missed the game. You'd see clips of the highlights maybe in some of the news, sports parts of the news hours, but that's all you'd get, maybe a clip, just a very short clip of something.
They did because they did that because they were afraid of conflicting with college and pro football.
Yeah, and it's true. They were, and they were losing ground. They started losing ground very rapidly to pro football in the 50s, and the minor leagues deteriorated quickly as a result of it. And pro football really started to come into its own by the end of the 50s, and probably that 58 title game had a lot to do with it. But we talked about some really interesting teams and interesting seasons here. I really enjoyed it because you've told me things I didn't know, and
you told me things that I sure as heck didn't know about 1991, and especially that. I mean,
yeah, the 1891 season has just never attracted the attention it should have, and it was proof positive. And Jim Mutry was probably bound for the Hall of Fame based upon his success with the Giants in the 80s. Was fired after the 1891 season as manager of the Giants, since he had done nothing to stop. Was obviously these games were rigged, and Mike King Kelly, and Boston, some members of the Boston team even discussed how they were going to do it before these games took place, and the Giants sat out Rusey, and they sat out Roger Connor, and they're all of famers, and played cast of second stringers, and there wasn't even any apparent effort on their part to even try to win it in those games. But
what year did Andrew Friedman take over the Giants?
After the '94 season, I believe.
Oh, okay. And,
yeah. 94. They really had a good team. Ward took them to the Temple Cup and won, beat Baltimore, and I think Friedman then took over the team in '95 and went downhill very quickly thereafter. But it's been fun. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, so did I. I learned a lot also. Yeah.
Well, I look forward to doing it again soon, and really had a good time today.
Okay, thank you very much. So did I.
Thank you, Al. It's been a pleasure once again.
Same here. I'm going to close out now. Give my best to Marilyn.
I will. Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.